Hello, welcome everyone to week 8 of the Perversion seminar. Now, I've got a lot of slides prepared, so we'll get into them. I'll probably be moving relatively rapidly, but you would all be well and used to that by now. And just organize my screen a bit better. There we go. Excellent. Okay, so as advertised, we're going to be talking about sublimation, perversion and sublimation. Now, I'm going to adapt today's seminar from chapter 2 of Lacan's Ethics and Nietzsche's Critique of Platonism from 2014. You see here the table of contents on the right. And in your LCA reading box, you already have chapter 1 there as an independent article called The Deflationary Ontology of Lacan and Nietzsche. So that sets up chapter 2, distinguishing weak sublimation from the strong, which we are going to focus on. Chapter 1 there is also available free from the open access from SUNY Press itself. Okay. So let's get into it. It's distinguishing weak sublimation from the strong. What is weak? What is strong? Let's recap chapter 1. Nietzsche criticized the good of Platonism, and we've been covering a lot of this so far. He criticized the good of Platonism and the Christendom to follow for creating an ideal that inhibited flourishing of stronger creative cultural types. So there's some issue with the ideal. The ideal of the good is repressive instead of encouraging. Right? And Nietzsche held we could make more intelligent use of drives and passions if we did not make an ideal out of demonizing or denying them. Now, in this seminar, we're going to consider whether Lacan's treatment of sublimation, held by Freud to be a non-pathogenic vicissitude of the drive, can help us to the nobler aims that Nietzsche's ethics incites. Let's have a look at what Freud and Lacan are going to say. The promise of sublimation and its discontents. So there's a sense where I'm running together at the top here, sublimation and civilization. Civilization is discontents. Isn't civilization a sublimation of base drives? Yes. How's it going? Yeah, it's got its discontents, right? It's not going fantastically. Now, what's Freud say about sublimation? In his 1914 narcissism paper, sublimation is a way out without involving repression. So it's supposed to get out of the neurotic jam of repression, right? A way out. Can it? Let's have a look. Let's have a look, for instance, at Friedrich Hacker, head of the IPA, gave this paper in 1972, Sublimation Revisited, where he aptly summarized what the field had sort of discovered so far on sublimation. 1972, so Freud's long gone by then. Lacan's in full flight. Hacker's a heavyweight of the IPA, the International Psychoanalytical Association, founded initially by Freud himself, and that Lacan was ejected from during the troubles of, when was that? Sometime in the 60s, mid-60s. Sublimation, says Hacker, according to the original Freudian concept, enacts the desexualization and de-aggressivation that alters the drive's primitive aims and objects to enable full intellectual discharge in a socially acceptable manner without the neurotic development or impoverishment of the organism. Sounds easy, yeah? Not too sexual, take some of that out. Not too aggressive, take some of that out. Not too primitive in its aims and objects, but still get full discharge. We're not repressed. We're still getting our satisfaction somehow because the drive's been sublimated somehow, right? What else? What does Freud say on narcissism? The same paper where he said sublimation could be a way out like this. While an ego ideal demands such sublimation, come on everyone, let's sublimate. Isn't that the way to go? Don't repress, don't act out, sublimate, okay? Let's create an ideal. You can demand such a sublimation from you and I, from all of us together, but it cannot enforce it. So there's a difficulty, Freud notes, in finding a possible convergence of ideal formation and sublimation. Why aren't these ideals we create to help us sublimate working? What else does Freud say in this paper? It is precisely in neurotics that we find the highest differences between what the ideal demands and how much sublimation we are capable of, right? And it's far harder to convince an idealist of the inexpedient location of their libido. Why is that? The clue: in a letter 1911 to a Boston physician who was complaining in just this way, right? My patients are not able to sublimate to their best ideals. How does Freud respond? He teaches that a drive cannot be sublimated as long as it is repressed. So that's the clue. The clue, right? The drive must be acknowledged before it can be sublimated. If the ideal that's trying to get us to sublimate is repressive, then it's going to take away that source that we need for sublimation, right? And you find this especially in idealists who don't want to acknowledge the real within, the libido within, the aggression within. What's Lacan say now in Seminar 7? So this is the major subdivision, the problem of sublimation, which we sent out for you to have a look at if you have the text already. And if you look on the right here, it's the second major subdivision of the ethics seminar, the problem of sublimation. These are all worth having a very, very close read in your own time at some point if you haven't already. If you have already, have a reread. Lacan's in rare form. And I'm going to cite and put a lot of these quotes on the slide too, so you can have a look with your own eyes. What's he say? He returns himself to the relations of this forming of an ideal to sublimation. For what governs us on the path of pleasure, says Lacan, is no sovereign good, which leaves us in a thoroughly enigmatic position relative to that which lies within das Ding. So if the ideal that we construct to encourage sublimation doesn't properly acknowledge what the drives want, where they really get their pleasures, those pleasures are going to lead us astray. Or they're going to lead us to distort the sovereign good in some way. With the sovereign good, as Kant in some ways intuited through the Christian tradition, it means denying pleasure. What governs us on the path to this sovereign good is actually pain, this ideal of the good. Especially in the Christian era, where the taboos got tighter than they were in Platonism or with Aristotle. Much tighter, actually. All right. Let's see what else we can uncover here. Now, Lacan starts off going through these sections on sublimation by basically outlining two major problems that sublimation needs to solve. First is a possible over-dominance by the drives coming from below, right? Beneath the bar, beneath the belt, however you want to say it, from the body, right? That's a problem. Second one is the opposite problem, though, and this is where it gets tricky, of an overzealous moral ideal designed to keep such drives at bay. So there's the rock, there's the hard place, if you like, and we're stuck in the middle, and sublimation's got to solve these two aspects of the problem. So let's look at the first one, our possible overdominance by the drives. What's wrong with that? It's the drives, they're natural, let them go, right? Why is that an issue? Let's have a look. This is in the first chapter of his problem of sublimation section, drives and lures. What's wrong with giving free rein to the drives? Says Lacan, it would not yield a normative balance with the world. It does not naturally lead to the domain of the pastoral, okay? Care for the other, right? And Lacan dismisses the idyllic Rousseauian view of the drives, which he finds in Freud's thought as a whole. This dismissal is in Freud's thought as a whole from the beginning. Resists being absorbed into this domain because of a very special quality of malice, of bad influence. You see a kind of similar move in Nietzsche up here on the right in his critique of Rousseau. He speaks of a return to nature that is more frightful nature and naturalness than return to nature idealists like Rousseau imagined. And Nietzsche adds that great tasks in the field of ethics are no longer possible without our mindfulness of these frightful aspects as well. Why? Because we can't sublimate these frightful aspects if they're repressed, because then we're unconscious about them. And they're going to come back in some kind of symptom or be acted out in some kind of aggression. That's why. Lacan continues. And he actually refers to Sartre's works, right? Actually quotes Sartre, Marquis de Sartre, to note that this malice, this malicious part of the drives, appears only fleetingly in a brief flash amidst our incredulity and disgust as that which may cause something strange to vibrate in us, which we call perverse desire, insofar as the darker side of natural eros enters into it. And that kind of echoes something he said in something he was writing at the same time. I think it's called The Discourse to Catholics, which came out as a book in the last 5 years or so, Discourse to Catholics and Triumph of Religion, where he says, thing we've known since the ancient mysteries, that Eros is a dark god, all right? The sadistic acts, it's a dark side of Eros. Libido and aggression can be tied up in these sorts of ways, as we know from the works of Sartre. He cites Freud, Lacan cites Freud while claiming he could have pretended he was from Sartre himself, right? To mock those who turn a deaf ear and prefer fairy stories about us instead, all right? Like this Rousseauian sort of idea that we're born free, but we're in chains, so change the social structures and then our natural goodness will come out because that's nature. Yeah, Freud's not going to buy that. He's saying a lot of things are nature. It's not just the goodness, yeah? I'm not going to get caught up in these fairy stories. Not only did he quote Sartre, but he quoted Sartre and pretended he was quoting Freud just to no, actually he quotes Freud while pretending it was from Sartre. Let's have a look what he says. Anyway, maybe I've misremembered. All right, the quote is from Freud, yeah. Chapter 5 of Civilization and Discontents. He says, man tries to satisfy his need for aggression at the expense of his neighbor, to exploit his work without compensation, to use him sexually without his consent, to appropriate his goods, to humiliate him, to inflict suffering on him, to torture and to kill him. So that's page 185 of Seminar 7 and 111 of Standard Edition 21 of Freud, Civilization and Discontents. Yeah, he cited Freud, but pretended he was still citing Sartre. Yeah, I think that's what he did. Just slipped into it to say, they're not completely dissimilar in some ways in their view of the drives. Sadism is something in us. What else does Lacan say on this topic in the Ethics Seminar? A certain 18th century philosophy, perhaps it was Sartre or someone similar, assumed at its task what might be called the naturalist liberation of desire. Or maybe he's talking about the idealists of the tradition. But they failed historically. Instead, we witnessed the growth in the incidence of genuine pathologies. Okay, that's from right at the start of the Ethics Seminar. Now, some more on the overdominance of the drives. Lacan, the object and the thing chapter, Seminar 7. He also notes the difficulty in making these drives satisfied by moderation. So we can't just give them a free rein. There's dark stuff in there too. But can we just satisfy them through moderation, like Aristotle wanted, right? Choose the mean course, keep things nicely in balance. That moderation or self-rossini that is meant to soberly regulate a human being's relations with his fellow human. Also got to remember that Aristotle's investment of self-rossini is a couple of centuries after the original classical way to do it, because he followed Plato. There's more honesty in the pre-Platonic tradition because the myths weren't whitewashed as yet. Lacan continues. He cites from Freud's Civilization and its Discontents, pointing to the historical record, to Genghis Khan, to the so-called pious crusaders and the horrors of the recent World War. He only had one to see. If he died just before the second one came out, and it was probably, 10 times as worse, which no one would have thought was possible after World War I. And Freud, what he says is, on our capacity for boundless aggressivity, on this claim that we have boundless aggressivity in us, we have no choice but to bow humbly before the truth of this view. Look at that little mushroom in the background. That's what we can do now. What's Lacan say? Transgression beyond the limits normally assigned to the pleasure principle in opposition to the reality principle. Right? The reality principle usually says, for your pleasures, go this far and no further. Right? You can't overdo it, you can't do this, you can't do that. Reality will kick in and say, if you do that, it will go against your self-preservation. Or if you do that, you'll be punished by society because they say that that's morally wrong, right? But when we do go beyond, it includes what is commonly known as perversion, right? And Lacan paints these macabre political scenarios. He talks about impotent crowds left dazed as they move towards the slaughterhouse. He speaks of the rise of nuclear weaponry, which, as he notes, just 2 years before the Cuban Missile Crisis shook the world, threatens the planet itself as a habitat for mankind. That's why I put a little image there of Juice Media people. So I'm going to give you another clip to see a recent example of the reemergence of this problem, which is by no means something that belongs to the past and just the past. So let's see. This is a satirical message from the Australian government. Now, can you all see this video?
We can see, yep.
Yep, okay. Let's play it. Wave your hand if you can't hear it or some other weird gremlin crops up. All right, let's go.
Hello, I'm from the Australian government. Now that we've completed our 20-year mission in Afghanistan by handing it back to the Taliban, it's time to blindly follow the American empire into another massive shit show. Introducing our new military partnership, AUKUS. You see, China's government, the CCP, has been a dickhead lately, threatening Taiwan, imprisoning millions in Xinjiang, illegally occupying islands in the South China Sea. Not that we give a shit about that. AUKUS allies are experts at illegally occupying islands like the Chagos Islands, where the Brits kicked out all the natives to build a US military base, an occupation the ICJ has just ruled to be unlawful, or like Guam and Hawaii and, well, all of Australia. But what worries us is that the CCP is trying to be as big a dickhead as us, and we can't have that, which is why we need AUKUS. To join AUKUS, we tore up a $90 billion submarine contract with the French and didn't even bother telling them in advance. AUKUS. Lol, remember how we said we couldn't cancel that $1 billion contract with Adani because it would create sovereign risk? So now you know we're full of shit. But hey, look on the bright side. By bullshitting and stabbing an ally in the back, now the whole world knows what it's like to be an Aussie under this government. Of course, our real sovereign risk is this guy. Because without consulting Parliament, Scotty from Announcements decided to buy nuclear-powered subs from the US. And since we can't fuel, maintain or deploy nuclear subs, that means he's chained our long-term defense policy to the US. You know, the country that's on the brink of civil war, where the current leader can't remember R1's name and the previous one still doesn't accept the outcome of the last election. Cool and normal, pal. Another perk of us having nuclear subs is that Australia will be a potential target for nuclear strikes. It also makes everyone less safe by weakening nuclear non-proliferation standards. But the best part of AUKUS is that we have no idea how much it'll fucking cost. Low estimates start at $100 billion. In a country that can't seem to afford $80 a day to lift people out of poverty or fund the NDIS or housing affordability and mental health, which is why the biggest fuck you of this deal isn't to France or China, but to every one of you. Fuck yes. Some say the best way of responding to the CCP's shitfuckery is to form stronger relationships with our close neighbours and together apply firm, consistent and united diplomacy, which is probably true. But then we wouldn't be able to wedge Labour on national security at the coming election. And that's what this bullshit announcement is really all about. Australian government. Authorised by the Department for Announcements and Photo Opportunities.
Okay, a satirical take on recent further proliferation of nuclear submarines. Now, the Juice Media crew, I've been looking into them a bit more. They also have a podcast where the scriptwriter Giordano basically interviews academics, people from the Australia Institute, just to sort of show what his sources are and back it up basically, and show what informs his satirical critique. And also, big left-wing academics have dropped in so far, like Naomi Klein, Noam Chomsky. It's pretty hard to get much bigger than that. Got to get Zizek in there at some point, I imagine. Left-wing politicians like Greens Member of Parliament in Melbourne, Adam Bandt, and a whole host of others. And some of them have just gone viral. Like Naomi Klein loves them, shares them all the time. So do a lot of people. So it's good to see some good left-wing activism coming out of Australia. Now, let's get back to these slides. There is a very specific point that we need to make vis-a-vis Lacan Seminar 7 here. Okay, such frightful possibilities, right? Rearming, spread of nuclear weapons, all these bullshit nationalism and militarism between rival power centers, trying to compete for who's the biggest dickers, right? Such frightful possibilities. It's tempting as a result of these to cling to the good more firmly, to contain the drives more firmly. But that's the trap. It's what forms the second problematic scenario that sublimation needs to counter. Because we assume it's the drives running wild. That's why we're doing all these like bullshit shit fuckery, as the satirists like to say. But why couldn't it also be the opposite? It's the dominance of a repressive ideal that's causing some kind of return. Let's see what Lacan says in the Ethics. Sartre's extraordinary catalogue of horrors. All right, we've seen an example of that, some examples of that in previous weeks. Is nothing at all, says Lacan, compared to what will be seen on a collective scale if the great and very real explosion occurs that threatens us all. The only difference, besides the fact that it happens to someone in the West rather than someone in the East, as it was done to Japan, which the Secretary of Defense at the time, what was his name? Forget his name, but he acknowledged that he and the leading general, Curtis LeMay, were acting as war criminals during that. Fogs of War, good documentary. But the only difference Lacan's going to point out, right, if this bomb goes off again, is that no pleasure will enter into the motivation of the latter. Right? Unlike in Sartre, if this bomb goes off, the person setting it off is not going to have any pleasure, unlike Sartre and his imaginary heroes. And this is the key line. Not perverts like Sartre, but bureaucrats will set things off. We won't even know if their intentions were good or if they were bad. It will go off by command, carried through according to regulations, mechanically down the chain of command, with human wills bent, abolished, overcome in a task that ceases to have any meaning. The elimination of an incalculable, accursed, it's my addition, waste that reveals its constant and final dimension for man. So much for the humanization of the planet, as some dreamer put it, says Lacan, because the pile of garbage is one of the sides of the human dimension that it would be wrong to mistake, a sepulchral mound at the limits of the politics of the good, of the general good, of the good of the community. So you might be thinking, oh yeah, the good's not being extended far enough. At the limit, we've got all this violence and rubbish, and Lacan's saying no. The good is precisely what causes the pressing down that leads to this accursed share being expelled in this way, an unacknowledged way. We will easily blow up the whole planet without thinking we're being perverse at all. We're doing it for the good. Not perverts, but bureaucrats will set things off, right? And that's what he's talking about in problem number 2, not the overdominance by the drives, but the second opposite problem of the overdominance of the ideal designed to keep such desire, such drives at bay. The overzealousness of the moral ideal. Better word choice. We have zealots in our history, in our cultural history in the West. Okay. What's Lacan say about this ideal? It's a zealously repressive ideal, which Lacan notes to bear insatiable character of cruelty, right? It's from Ethics Seminar 7, page 89. Freud is talking about a superego, right? It's the best metaphor ever. It ends up lording it over us like a garrison in a conquered town. So imagine when you're walking through the village square, life seems normal, but there's a really well polished army just camped there, surrounded by strong men, armor, sharp spears and swords. They're not saying anything. They're not making direct eye contact with you, but you know they're looking. And as soon as you look at them, they look away and they're just sitting there waiting. And you know, they've got you, right? That's the superego, like a garrison in a conquered town. The victory's already won. They don't have to do much now. They're already in there. These ideals are so opposed to our drives that they do not exhibit ethical behavior, but rather punish us for even having drives. As Freud puts it, calling the ego to account, not only for its deeds, but equally for its thoughts and unexecuted intentions. I'm not doing anything wrong, am I? Were they looking at me? It's that sort of internalization of the panopticon that Foucault likes to talk about in Discipline and Punish. Notes a paradoxical cruelty to this ideal, so far as it begins to ape the thing, the Freudian thing, the id, right? The polymorphous perversity of the drives that's meant to oppose, drawing on its violence like a parasite fed by the satisfactions that are accorded to it, growing crueler and crueler even as we offend it less and less by abstaining from acts, prosecuting at the most intimate levels of impulses or desires. I quoted this in previous slides. This can lead to a dangerous dishonesty from fear of conscience. I'm not going to admit I've got these drives. Superego will kill me. It wasn't me. All right, it's unconscious. It can still be acted out in some ways. Maybe I'm going to help the superego kiss ass, right? Help it like performance violence, for example, to show how innocent I am. What happens, Lacan says, it leads to the inner catastrophes of neurosis and its consequences. It's the kind of superego that makes us internalize aggression until we are riddled with melancholia and self-hate, a moralism decried as the malfunctioning of the brakes, which should limit its proper authority. Hence the peculiar charge and appeal of Cronenberg's film, The Crash, where people deliberately crash the car, drive into a crash as some kind of strange jouissance. Now, Freud, as we quoted in previous weeks from the resistance and psychoanalysis, such repressive ideals should be replaced by a better and secure procedure with a reduction in strictness and more play given to truthfulness, right? No more garrisons, no more priesthoods. Otherwise, we are met with the ferocity of an ascetic ideal made sovereign, as if turning on the drives against the drives were an end in itself, causing the ressentiment and bad conscience that Nietzsche discloses in the genealogy of morals as fundamentally nihilistic or against life. So, all right, let's go back to sublimation and say, you got a lot of work to do, mate. Do you really have this remedial power to get us out of this double bind? Over dominance of the drives versus the over dominance, over zealousness of the ideal. Pressure from below and pressure from the top. Sometimes they seem to join forces. You renounce, gives more power to the superego, hits you more. Circle, circle. Now, let's have a look at what Mark de Kessel has to say in his book, Eros and Ethics. This book came out in the same SUNY series that my book and Russell's book came out in between. So when I was finishing off that PhD and getting into converting it to a book, that came out and I hired it from the Deakin Library and was reading it and started working it in a little bit, discussing it with Russell. Right, what's he say? De Kessel, Freud's treatment of sublimation, his treatments of sublimation are seriously heterogeneous in themselves. So he doesn't think there's that much consistency there. There's a more or less positive concept in mind, where the drives are diverted from primitive aims to become the driving force behind art, science, and other typical cultural activities. But, de Kessel says, Freud characterizes sublimation as a destiny of the drive that must be distinguished from repression, as the drive is still able to gain pleasure. Okay, yeah. He continues, now following Freud, Lacan distinguishes three subcategories of culture: art, religion, and science. Now, these sublimations, is religion a sublimation, for example? Doesn't it depend which one, as we've been discussing a lot by bringing in some genealogy, some historical perspective on the changing of religion, doing a little bit of ethnography? It is a problem, right? What? Such sublime cultural activities can rely on repressing some portion of the truth. The obvious case being with certain types of religions, right? The Christian Platonic ones, for example, where loss of truthfulness is one of the problems with repression, sublimation must counter. What's Lacan say? The sublimations of art can involve a repression of the thing through the hysterics process of encircling. So hang on a second. If there's repression, is it sublimation? Right? So Lacan sort of keeps slipping into this himself, right? This ambiguity. Whereas the sublimations of religion can involve displacement through obsessional traits, avoiding. All right, isn't that not neurosis if there's displacements going on? Sublimations of positive science can even involve truth loss through a paranoid procedure of unbelief, where the thing is first repudiated or foreclosed. So if we think of the objectifications of science that Sandra brought in the discussion last week, where science forgets itself and starts being an ideology, positivism. I'm not going to believe anything Freud said. I only believe in hard, testable, empirical science. That's good, but in an eliminative and reductive way. Ooh, that's not good. You're not the only science in town. There's also the humanities, social sciences, right? Sure, we're not as exact, but we're dealing with more complex phenomena, intersubjective phenomena, group psychological phenomena, psychoanalytic phenomena. So we have this problem. There are traces of repression seeming to flow into sublimation. What's Lacan say? A prior elision of a thing marks the space through which every sublimation must occur. In every form of sublimation, it's a quote, every emptiness is determinative. Okay, but is that through a neurotic repression of some sort? Oops. There we go. Lacan gives the example of courtly love. When the romanticized lady, as the sublimated, poeticized object of desire, seems emptied of all real substance, deprived of flesh and blood, becoming a terrifying and inhuman partner, as arbitrary as possible in the tests she imposes on her servant, as cruel as are the tigers of Hircania. Hircania, I believe, is in northern regions of Iran, on the bottom of the Caspian Sea, that mentioned by people like Herodotus and Augustine. Don't know why I looked it up, just looking for a tangent, mental break. Anyway, okay. And also there's that huge example in Seminar 7 where a poem that appears in Courtly Love, where the lady asks the knight to basically give her cunnilingus to prove his loyalty to her. And he just gets hysterical. I'm not going to do that. It could, it's just, for the symbol of negation, though, it's still, it's pretty pornographic. If you take away the symbol of negation, it's like pretty graphic. It's almost pornography. And Lacan uses that as an example to say that you don't necessarily have to have complete desexualization for sublimation to occur. What the instinct aims for in sublimation, says Lacan, and what generally we cannot help but demand, is to be deprived of something real. Okay, it doesn't seem too bad. Deprived, maybe that's too strong. I don't know if that's sublimation anymore, right? Or maybe he's just speaking with Freud and speaking with all the inconsistencies and ambiguity that we've inherited through the psychoanalytic tradition. Now, so we speak about the potential for a loss of truth, loss of truthfulness in sublimations if they involve repression of the thing. We don't even know what it is anymore, right? But if repression's coming in, so is renunciation. So how much renunciation can we take? Because sublimation, if tainted by repression, will not offer full satisfaction. Lacan, a complete sublimation is not possible for the individual. We find ourselves faced with limits. There is something that cannot be sublimated, as there exists a demand for a certain level of direct satisfaction, without which harm results. Serious disturbances occur. There's a limit to how much we can sublimate our drives. That's why it says at another point, sublimate as much as you want. Eventually you'll have to pay for it with something, and that something is your jouissance. Right? Now, he's actually taking that from Freud's Civilized Sexual Morality and Modern Nervous Illness paper from 1908, where Freud uses an engineering analogy of the limit to how much heat can be converted into mechanical energy in our machines, right? Similarly, a certain amount of direct sexual satisfaction seems to be indispensable for most organizations, and a deficiency in this amount, which varies from person to person, visited by phenomena which, on account of their harmful effects on functioning and their quality of unpleasure, must be regarded as an illness. Right. So think of the engineering metaphor. Think of, say, a coal-fired power station, which Australia loves to promote to the world, expanding coal mines on Indigenous lands, expanding gas exploration and fracking, risking farmlands and water supplies. Loves it. Still tries to pretend it's reducing emissions. When you burn that coal, not all of it's going to turn into heat, right? Some of it's going to be that shitty smoke that creates climate change. Some of it's going to be that crappy soot that sits there at the bottom. It resists being transformed into the heat you want. Well, the heat's there to turn a turbine, turning water into steam, which then becomes electricity. Now, for some types of people, Freud concludes, it would have been more healthy for them to be less good. They can't quite, transform it all, right? They need to do something direct. In his papers on technique, 1912, he notes that for weaker types, depicted, as he puts it, of being of only moderate worth, which might sound a bit harsh, but if you think of the great scientist with his regimented lifestyle, okay, that's his idea of worth, okay. Most people can't do that, I agree, right? So, but with them, now he's being tolerant here. One must be content if one has won back some degree of capacity for work and enjoyment. At least some degree, right? As to press them unduly towards sublimation could make life even harder for them, right? But we should also note that our capacity for sublimation also depends on access to educative conditions and ideals that are not so privative in structure. So if you're living in the third world or in the working class in precarious conditions where health and education are poorly funded, where there's a history of violence and poverty in the family, it may not be your fault if you're not able to sublimate them into the scientific heights that a great mind like Freud was able to achieve. We're acknowledging that. What's Freud saying in Greek psychology, 1921? Here's another rub, right? It's not just people who had poor backgrounds or don't seem to have a talent for sublimation. The presence of repression is also in the sublimations of higher types, right? Our configurations of desire typically contain, quote, any degree of admixture of sublimated drives with the unsublimated. They can be transformed back into them just as they arose out of them. So we can sublimate a drive, but then that drive can itself be desublimated. It sort of is oscillating between the two. Now the sublimation reaches the heights. Now it's failing, becomes neurotic, or the perversion comes out, right? And he quotes, when he looks at Leonardo da Vinci, hence this wonderful backdrop I prepared for you here, right? Even the highest types like Leonardo da Vinci, and it's not just that Leonardo da Vinci is a Renaissance man, it's just the idea of a Renaissance man was basically modeled after him himself. So you can't get higher than Leonardo da Vinci, but even he, right, Freud's saying, has repression mixed in with his sublimations, which at various points holds him back to indecision and despair that is neurotic in essence, despite his still at times extraordinary capacity for sublimating the primitive instincts that left his epoch far behind him. And as I was, for some of you who caught that discussion with Frank Gensel that I did on the weekend, I was mentioning this paper, and Freud says, like, my opponents are going to think I'm trying to blacken the radiant in noting all this stuff in Leonardo, but he goes, I'm not. I'm just trying to say that these tendencies that we find in the unconscious are there even in our highest types, even in our greatest sublimators. You're going to have perverse elements which are reacted against, which means it's now a neurotic element. So yeah, there's hope for us all yet, right? Even the greats have their hesitation. So don't write yourself off, don't write anyone off. It's not to say it's easy. We don't want to push everyone or ourselves in some kind of dumb neoliberal way beyond our capacities as well. That would also be unfair. Now, Hacker summarizes the problems. Hang on for 1 sec. Okay. I just wanted you to give you all a chance to read the quotes there and put my jacket on. Got chilly. Anyway, Hacker summarizes these problems, right? Towards the end of his paper. Sublimation, despite its promises, is available only to a very few, only under particularly favorable circumstances, and even so remains constantly subject to regressive pulls, resulting in diffusion, i.e. resexualization and re-aggressivation, and desublimation. So he acknowledges the problems, right? There was a promise there, but then after all, it's 1972, it's like, it's got a lot of work to do. It doesn't seem to be the absolute solution we're hoping for. Right. Now, this mixing, right, of desublimation and sublimation means it's even hard for us to differentiate sublimation from modes of defense thought to be pathogenic in structure. Right. Lacan in his ethics, he talks, for example, of the character trait built on a reaction formation that is antagonistic to the anal drive, as pointed to in Freud's 3 essays. Hacker on sublimation, on Freudian sublimation. But there's another part of the Freudian theory that we've got to bring in to try and solve this problem, right? Because Freud also says it's the amount of social valorization that these vicissitudes of the drive achieve that determines whether sublimation has been reached. But only more problems are created here because, and this is Hacker, me paraphrasing, cultural judges of varying times and traditions do not always find consensus here. And psychoanalysts in this role of judge often fare no better. So this is also a cautionary warning to those of us who study psychoanalysis, to think that we are so culturally, superior that we can judge accurately when there's a neurosis, when there's a sublimation. Hacker says, not so fast, right? Because after all, you'll note, some analysts can class the same act of social protest as an uncontrolled acting out of unresolved Oedipal and other infantile conflicts that others would call a heroic sublimation, authentically expressing a truly humane vision. So even with someone like Antigone, right? Someone like Zizek saying, yes, heroic sublimation, expressing humane vision, where others are like, yeah, no, she's acting out her hysterics discourse, it's a connection to the father, looking for a master to reign over, right? Yeah. But what if you look, someone says to like the juice media guys, oh yeah, that's your hysteric discourse. You're just looking for a master to reign over. Yeah, what you're saying isn't true. It's just, you're just acting out your Oedipus complex. You're just angry at your father. And that's why, it's good that they actually back it up by doing podcasts and getting experts from the CSIRO or from the Australian Bureau of Meteorology, for example, who've resigned because of what conservatives are doing to doctor the science, to hoodwink the public about the dangers of their pathetic energy policy. So we've got to be careful. We've got to also look at the empirical and historical record when we start applying psychoanalytic categories, right, to acts of social protest or any like sublimation. That's not a sublimation, that's just neurosis. Yeah, what are you basing that on? Yeah, we've got to have facts, empirical facts externally as well, or else we could misapply it. Right? And it's important we get this right? Because at the end of civilization is discontents. Freud talks about technology reaching the point where we are more than capable of exterminating one another to the last man. He hadn't even seen the success of the Manhattan Project, and he was, writing was on the wall, right? So required then is still a working concept of sublimation to help guide our way out. It might not be perfect, but it's all we got, right? Despite its above-mentioned limitations. So now we can cross to Lacan's attempt to negotiate the limits of sublimation that we've been discussing, read as an attempt or read it as an attempt to stop such limits from closing in. So we can pass through without losing anything more than our tail feathers. How are you going to do this? Why not improve our access to intelligent cultural judges and intellectual traditions? Isn't that in a sense what Lacan is in a way, or has done? If you look at Freud and his inner circle there, probably all doctors, nothing wrong with that, scientists are fantastic. But Freud himself said, this should be like a liberal arts college too. We should be a little bit more poly in here. Cross-cut to Lacan, is he surrounding there with a room full of his fellow doctors? Not at all. I can see Sartre, I can see Camus, I can see de Beauvoir, I can even see Pablo Picasso, right? And I've put here in my notes, it would have also been good to have a photo of Lacan at Asafal in the College of Sociology, where Bataille was in full flight, and he met Celia as well. Now, looks like something funky has just happened there. Oh yeah, don't worry about that. That intervallo was supposed to remind me at the end of this slide to take a break, intermission, but it's just gone to the top, but now I can't forget. Okay, last slide before a break, and then we look at Lacan's solution in detail, right? Quoted here, Michel Rickman, right? It was Bataille, Caillois, and Léry who first took the ethnographic detour in the founding of the College of Sociology in the late 1930s. So when Lacan's talking about, got to do a little of ethnography, let's do some ethnography. Hey, and not just archaic cultures, pre-Platonic Greek cultures, also courtly love, right? Hamlet, the troubadours, looking at their poetry, looking at their romanticizing of the lady, right? Bataille and Co were talking about this in the college in the late 1930s, which Roudanesco notes the early gatherings of which were held in Lacan's apartment, right? What else does Roudanesco say? Lacan was also a silent presence at the secret activities of Acéphale. So probably only Sanchez is across this, but there was the College of Sociology, which was a public institution where they pursued this ethnographic detour. Then there was a journal called Acéphale connected to this college, right? And then there was a secret society, Acéphale, which was a secret Nietzschean society to create a kind of Nietzschean religion based on a returning of sacred erotic transgression. And Lacan was a silent witness at those gatherings. Not many people who were involved talk much about it, or else it wouldn't be a secret, eh? But there are other groups that were held in Lacan's apartment too. For example, groups such as Contre-Attaque, right? Which was the group just before the College of Sociology in the earlier 1930s, probably around 34, 35, which is when the socialists and the surrealists tried to get together to do something about the rise and resurgence of fascism. The bourgeois was corrupt, right? Marx, there was something insufficient about Marxism. It was too reductive and eliminative. Stalin was betraying the revolution. People would start going to the far right. It was starting to take hold in France too, right? Spain lost, Germany lost, Italy lost, right? So these are very important gatherings. So in terms of being a good cultural judge, it helps to be across and be experiencing these sorts of oeuvres. And Lacan was, to his credit. Now, Roudanesco also notes that Lacan read Nietzsche. I've mentioned that in previous talks, so you can read that in your own time. Now, Louis Sass is an article on Lacan, Mind of a Modernist. Right? He says, the real imaginary symbolic episteme of Lacan's is an expression of his essentialist modernist sensibility, which is no surprise given how in Paris Lacan frequently visited surrealists and other avant-garde groups with a lively interest in the latest developments in philosophy, literature, and the human sciences, for example, linguistics, structuralist anthropology, ethnography, later mathematics, knot theory, non-Euclidean geometry, right? While his second marriage was to Sylvia Maclès, estranged wife of his friend Bataille, infamous for his writings on the necessity of transgression in both sexuality and religion, which Lacan has partly participated in, and in Seminar 7 discusses the jouissance of transgression. Now, what is modernism? As Ezra Pound put it, the idea that you've got to make it new, right? Why did they want to make it new? Because they felt that the Enlightenment project had failed. There's more violence, there's more purposeless chance in human nature than we previously thought. It's not going very well. And that's where Freud and Nietzsche became very, very important influences in modernism, right? At Sass follows Clement Greenberg, he defines modernism post-Kantianly as questioning internal forms of time and space, and thus the very structure of reality, suggesting Lacan would supplement Freud's concepts to bring them into conformity with these modernist concerns, while also enriching modernism too. So there's bring some modernism into psychoanalysis, bring some psychoanalysis into modernism. And that post-Kantian thing is because Kant basically thought that Euclidean geometry, space and time, that's just that's a priori true. but he was before Einstein. So now we know it's not. Now we've got curved space and non-Euclidean geometry. So that's why Lacan has those really, those geometric shapes where inside and outside are confused, when the twist makes the inside the outside, depending where you are on the amoeba strip and everything else, right? Good fun. However, not all modernism was doing this, looking at post-Kantian, post-Euclidean abstractness. There was also primitivism that was part of the modernist tradition, and that's where the surrealists came in, right? So, for example, they would look at what the cave cultures were doing too, and trying to make their experience somehow lucid, right? So they wanted to return to some kind of primitive archaic tradition, what the Renaissance was doing, but not getting stuck at Plato and Aristotle, going before Plato and then elsewhere across all continents, right? To see how that can enrich our thinking, and so we can come back to the present with something new. So that's, might seem paradoxical that modernism can involve primitivism. That's the point. It's not to go back and be primitive. It's about seeing what we can gather, what was lost, right, as we moved on from that, to bring it back and replenish the present, which can help keep this modernist project deeply rooted in the earthly realm. Okay, 7:53. We'll take an early break and come back in 10 minutes, which will be 8:03. Yep, and we'll resume then with Lacan's solution to the problem of sublimation. Welcome back, everyone. Okay, 2 points I forgot to mention on the previous slide was that Lacan's also long-term engagement with philosophy. His avid reading of Nietzsche when he was in his early 20s, as he was breaking away from his family's religion, getting his brother into trouble by getting him to read a brilliant eulogy of Nietzsche's thought, and his interest in philosophy and Lacanians in philosophy has never really ceased. So, for example, some of the best philosophical discussions I used to have were with Lacanians after a while, and it's, you know, how I ended up here. So that interest is also there and also very important. Not everything in philosophy is, knee-jerk idealism. There's some good criticisms in there too, and good constructions in there too. Historically important, some of them still valid to this day. And there's also, when it comes to the surrealists and their investment in ethnography that Bataille shared and Lacan shared and Lacan's other surrealist friends shared, was about using Freudian techniques of free association to try and uncover some of this primitive unconscious aspect of the drive that's been repressed and rejected. The polymorphous perversity that Freud talks about, and that was enacted in these sacred rituals by pre-Christian Platonic structures. So that's what's new about the surrealists too, using automatic writing as his technique, which Bataille cites Breton very directly after the war. He's getting this straight from Freud. Okay, now recap of where we've come to. Lacan's treatment of sublimation. It's got a lot of work to do. Recap, 2 main problems that it has to solve: the mediated violence and perversity of the drives. 1, 2, the ideal that's meant to oppose them but turns their perversity back on the self to create neurosis and as an extension acting out. Then we discussed 2 main problems that sublimation seems to preserve. First, a repression of our awareness of the thing at the center of our drives that leads to violence unknowingly, loss of knowledge of truth. And 2, a repression of the amount of direct satisfaction we attain that leaves us trying to sublimate beyond our capacity, loss of satisfaction, become impoverished. We're sad creatures again, sad and aggressive, right? And this led to the further problem, or main problem, of how to tell if sublimation was taking place at all, especially when indexed to the amount of social valorization achieved, as this can vary across different cultural judges across different times, which is why it's so important that figures like Lacan were so interested in the top quality cultural judges that we have from the history of our tradition that we can find. Right, and this is actually on the right here, just a little scan of the first page of the problem of sublimation section, major subdivision. And just have a look at how Lacan's framing his inquiry into sublimation. All right, just follow the asterisks here, right? We're doing the ethics of psychoanalysis. It's leading us to a problematic point, not only of Freud's doctrine, but of what one might call our responsibility as analysts. If you haven't seen it coming, here it is. It's something so problematic for theorists of analysis, right? But it's so essential. It's what Freud called sublimation. So it's a very important issue we're dealing with here. Sublimation is the other side of the research that Freud pioneered into the roots of ethical feeling, insofar as ethical feeling imposes itself in the form of prohibitions, those coming from the moral conscience. Right, you're looking at the positive side of this, the other side, right? And we end up in what's known as the philosophy of values. The positive side, that of moral and spiritual elevation, that of the scale of values. Can psychoanalysis really help us on the question of values, the question of the creation of values, the reevaluation of values, cultural problems? Will sublimation help us? Is it different to the confessional, for example? Have we got something else up our sleeve besides more knowledge? Do we also have a better technique of treatment besides mere confession and renunciation? Let's have a look at what Lacan does in Seminar 90. This is his positive attempt to solve the problem. The other quotes where he's laying out that it's got a lot of work to do, right? As we know from the rest of the psychoanalytic literature. Now, the main thing he does is to distinguish the trieb, drive, and the instinct, right? You might see heaps of quotes there where you see drive, instinct, right? This is where he does that, page 90, right? De Kessel says, Lacan says the drive should in no way be confused with instinct. Why? To point to the primacy of the signifier in relation with the drives. All right, what's he talking about there? Can he be more specific? What is the primacy of the signifier in relation to our drives? Lacan, the drive and not the instinct, the trieb and not the instinct is the main concern of psychoanalysis. And it comes from Freud's ability to render the drives unmasked through interpretation amidst the play of signifiers in the play of substitutions. All right, because these drives come to us masked, tangled up in signifiers. Think of the last dream you had. Was it really straightforward? Kill that person, have sex with that person? Or was it like a fish with an apple? Was it an umbrella in a tree? You know, it could be anything, right? It's the surrealist aspect. The drives come floating in all these images. Lacan, the drives come already tangled up in the signifiers and thus should not be confused with their relation to a natural milieu, not reduced to it anyway, right? The drive is not the instinct. Now, let's have a look at what Freud said on the relation between instinct and drive. This is from the Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, which I've put in square brackets here as it says instincts, but Freud probably said trieb, which is drive, triebe, right? What's he say about the triebe, which probably was translated as instinct? It's a psychical representative of the stimuli originating from within the organism and reaching the mind, whereupon it undergoes ideation by symbolic and imaginary structures, all right? But the stimuli come from the body, right? That's the instinct. When it reaches the mind, right, it moves from instinct to drive. That's when we start signifying it in a way. Images form of it, or of what it wants. We start articulating it. I want this, I don't want that, right? That's the difference between the instinct and the drive. And the drive happens when we start symbolizing it and imaging it. The instinct, conversely, stays deeper within our somatic portion of the real. It remains as instinct and is never the drive as long as it is yet to reach the frontier point Freud points to between the mental and the somatic. So that frontier is very important. I think, concept in Freud, right? That line where it crosses and consciousness starts beginning. Of course, we might not like what we see, so we can still repress it again, but at one point there was a line. Instinct came, we signified it, maybe we negated it, gets pushed back under, but that's repression. What's Freud saying in the 3 essays, the 1915 edition? An instinct, Triebe, drive, is the psychical representative of an endosomatic, coming from within the body, endosomatic, continuous flowing source of stimulation, lying on the frontier between the mental and the physical. So it can't be clearer, right? So for those who think in the beginning was the word, I say to them, actually, I think in the beginning was the grunt. The word comes later, right? Now, what else does Freud say in the Claims of Psychoanalysis, the Scientific Interest, 1913? He talks about this frontier as being that between the spheres of psychology and those of biology. So he has all these places in his work where he starts going, okay, I'm starting to tread into biology here. I'm going to come back on my side, right? I belong on this side of the frontier because I'm a psychologist. Yeah, we stay informed. We know there's a trading zone. We know there's biology within us, but that's almost so far removed from what we deal with in our everyday phenomenological experience. And we're going to be the science that sticks with psyche, right? We're on the top of that frontier. Biology is on the bottom, on the instinct side. We're on the drive side, right? And you'll find Lacan making all these points here. If you follow the asterisks, the point where the trieb is unmasked, the trieb, but not the instinct. So the instinct is not far from the field of dusting, Lacan's Freudian thing, or the id, right? Okay, the drift, right. I'm going to quote those on the next page, so you can come back to that. Maybe I'll come back to that with you, right? Because Lacan also builds the concept of the thing into this drive instinct distinction. All right, where is the thing relative to the drive in the mind and the instinct in the body? Where's the thing? Stating that in Freud, the trieb is unmasked, the trieb, but not the instinct. ... For the instinct is not far from the field of dusting, which is his new word for das es, the it, right? Which was translated as the id in later Freud. So this not far suggests that dusting remains coupled closer with the instinct on the somatic level of the real. Right? That's my evidence for this interpretation. Page 90, those exact quotes. Lacan adds, any object of the drive, so this is a further thing, right? Any object of this drive, not the instinct, but the drive, is not the same as that which is aimed at the horizon of the instinct. Right? That's a direct quote there from 98, which suggests that the object is coupled more with the drive at the level of the signifier instead. For insofar as this object is aimed at by the drive and not the instinct, ideation and representation have already occurred. Okay, so the object is not just a pure natural object, all right? It's one that we are symbolizing and imaging via this drive, which used to be an instinct, but is not anymore, because the drive has also been symbolized and imaged. It has a name for a direct specific object. We look at that object, that's through our consciousness, that's being symbolized and imaged. At some primitive level, instinct is going for it too, right? But that's at the level of the id, if you like, right? At the instinct, at the thing. What's Lacan say? Is precisely on the slope of that difference that the problem of sublimation is situated for us. A difference between drive and object on the one hand, and instinct thing at the other. And the difference is where we're going to see if we can solve. That's where the problem of sublimation is occurred, and that's where the solution is going to be. Specify what the problem is, where it is. Let's see if we can get a solution out of it. Engineer one. What else does he say on this difference? The problem of sublimation must begin with the recognition of the plasticity of instincts, right? Which is sometimes he's still coming up with this distinction between drive and instinct. So sometimes, like Freud, he'll say instinct, but he says here the plasticity of the instinct. And just by putting plasticity there, he's already referring to the instinct after it has reached the mental sphere and become the drive, which aims for an object via the signifier. Because the instinct probably doesn't have that much plasticity moving around, right? That's the drive. Once it goes over that gap, once it goes over that discontinuity, sure, there's continuities in there, it's part of a process, but there's also a discontinuity there too, difference. Here he's calling it difference, right? The slope of that difference. He emphasizes everything that has to do with the trieb, the drives, raises the question of plasticity and limits. There's only so far that plasticity can go as well, right? Or I spent that with just neurosis again. But by conflating drive with instinct, which Lacan notes to occur through a translation difficulty of trieb, which Strachey also notes it too. He puts it in a footnote saying there was no adjectival form of drive, so I couldn't use drive. I had to use instinct, because I can say instinct and instinctual. I can't say drive and drive-your. And I didn't think any of the other words, I put a list of them on the right here, would help either, even though some of them are pretty good representations of what happens to the drive once it becomes, the instinct once it becomes a drive. Pushes, it drifts, propels, it floats, but there's still force, right? They all have their have the truth to them. It makes rise. Sure does. Right. But because of this translation difficulty, the temptation was to treat the drives as biological instinctual fixities instead of capable of what Lacan calls that drift. Via the signifier, they can open a door, a way, or a career of sublimation and give satisfaction to the subject in more than one way. That drift, where the whole action of the pleasure principle is motivated. So Lacan kind of starts using drift, also a translation of Trieben, because it starts wandering by the signifier once it enters into the psychic sphere, the instinct. And so you end up with a fish on a bicycle, or an umbrella in a sewer, or whatever strange thing you can think of. Right. Nevertheless, Lacan qualifies. The true nature of the drive, insofar that it is not simply instinct, is also to have a relationship to das Ding as such. The thing as it is distinct from the object. All right. So the discontinuities can't be inflated and exaggerated as if there's no origin in the instinct or no relation to the thing. Right. That's what he's saying there. How does the Kessel articulate it? The drive thus reveals itself in the distance from the thing with which it is a relation. The drive is at a certain distance from the thing, but still has a relation with it. It's a paradoxical, this is me, a paradoxical relation of both nearness and farness, as the drive orbits the thing in search of an object. I think de Kessel uses this orbit metaphor as well, where all of the objects through and by which the drive lives as an object relation are marked by this distance. So you can sort of see this image on the right here that I drew. Eugenie is probably familiar with it because I drew it for those Bataille lectures I gave at the Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy all those years ago. So I'll dig it out again. Right, there's the thing and the instinct. There's the object and the drive, circling, orbiting at a distance from it. Right, has a relation to it, even though it's distant to it. It's not right up the top, off the screen, off the chart. It's in some kind of relation of distance and nearness. There's one further piece of theory to add to this, bit of psychoanalytic theory, to help us articulate the pieces, the mechanisms at play in this problem of sublimation, to see if we can then solve it better. This object relation, says Lacan, has to be read Freudianly, according to the Freudian theory of the narcissistic foundations of the object and its insertion into the imaginary register. What does he mean? What he's saying is that a subject, down the bottom here, chooses an object that is perpetually interchangeable with the love the subject has for its own image, founded narcissistically through this mirage relation, in a narcissistic relation, an imaginary relation, right? Because if you think about the relation between the object and the thing is not just straight instinct. It's the history of that instinct emerging and attaching itself to everyone around you since you were a baby. The mother and the father, the different parts of the mother and the father, siblings, family, teachers, culture in general, right? Also partners, friends, loved and lost. That's all there, part of the thing too, right? So when we choose an object and it becomes sublime for us, it's because it somehow reminds us of these internalizations that we have from previous object choices. So we love them because they remind us of something in the past that we loved and lost. So that adds another dimension to this drive, instinct, thing-object relation. Of course, narcissism has a negative connotation for us, and there's also a warning there, right? Because of course, reading from the right, past object choices instill ideals in us, right, as we try to emulate through identification those we desire, or hang on to them in some way. But if we have chosen poorly or have no choice, we don't choose our parents, we don't choose our world, we don't choose our culture or subaltern group, right? If we have bad identifications that have happened, bad internalizations, bad object choices, we don't get sublimation by remembering these things, but what Lacan calls the problem of identification, where psychological splitting results as a subject becomes repressed and dependent on an idealized, forced image of itself. So instead of, if you look at the diagram, this arrow coming on the left, sublimation, hovering nicely over the thing, we get a narcissistically founded object that somehow creates a block. The thing is repressed as in neurosis, disavowed as in perversion, or foreclosed as in psychosis. Block, we don't have access to the thing. There's no conduit between the thing and the object. There are all sorts of blocks going on. So the aim is to see if we can get to this left side here and not get stuck on the right side. That's what sublimation is trying to do. Right. Lacan continues. Precisely that object is not the thing to the extent that the latter, the thing, is at the heart of a libidinal economy. So there's always a difference there, right? There's always some distance. The object is not the thing itself. Recap, he's referring to that relation of nearness and farness towards the thing, of not just the drive, which is no longer the instinct, but it's narcissistically founded object as well. So there's two distances going on there, drive and the object. How does de Kessel put it? The sublimated drive maintains itself in the space between the level of the imaginary and the symbolic objects on the one hand, and that of the thing on the other. And this difference gives the drive's true nature a chance. I like that formulation. Give the drive's true nature a chance. Having more knowledge of its nature, all the little micro elements of it. Structural relations to the thing, the object and the thing. Sublimation. It's going to answer for itself here, right? Sublimation. We can found an object that signifies the thing at an optimal distance if we give the drive's true nature a chance, rather than hint directly towards the thing, as in criminal perversion, or attempt to blindly repress it, as in neurosis, right? Don't jump in, don't jump too far out either. We can do this though, set up this optimal distance, or try to, or help each other to, because each object of the drive is already a kind of substitute relative to the thing. The thing is what we initially want, but we're caught up with objects, right? The object is not the thing, just as the drive's not the instinct. Right, we're caught up in a kind of substitute, although not with proper sublimation, one that only returns post-repression with what Lacan calls the ambiguity and double causality of the symptom as a compromise formation. We are well placed for sublimation if we just let the Lacanian primacy of the signifier come to the fore, right? Give the drive's true nature a chance. And we can be the kind of subject in this way who knowingly raises an object to the dignity of a thing, which is how Lacan eventually formulates sublimation most definitively for himself. We raise the object to the dignity of the thing. It's not exactly the thing, but still has respect for the thing. It's not too far from it either. Not too low, try too long in the fire till you burn. Not too high till we get above the bar, above the split, and end up with neurotic substitution, if not worse, the symptom. Right. Lacan on the drive. It's already deeply marked by the articulation of the signifier. It comes back at this at the end of the ethics seminar, 293. Right, that's what de Kessel saying. Give the drive's true signifying nature its chance. The primacy of the signifier is what's important in Lacan's attempt to treat the issue of sublimation. We can use the signifier, how, in our everyday lives, to alter how objects appear to us, to foreground some of their properties, to make them seem sublime, which draws on and evokes the passions of the things. Artists do this particularly, right? Their framing and their selection, foregrounding, backgrounding, tweaking, altering, trying different lenses, different filters, right? That's sublimation. We draw on the passions of the thing. without sticking your face in it or without trying to deny it, right? How does Dylan Evans put it in his Lacanian dictionary? Sublimation, I like this, it relocates an object in the position of a thing, right? Don't put it up there off screen, in the position of a thing, so it gets some of the energy from it, the dignity of the thing. Relocates it, doesn't chuck it in, it relocates, so it hovers over it. For now, the thing is a little more present in its absence as it shines forth in the passion with which we raise an earthly object, an ordinary earthly animal bodily object, to the sublime, to a divine sublime, to a passion sublime, in a process akin to the imaginative activity involved in love and artistic creativity in general. Lacan's complaint. Okay, this is another thing. He's already solved that problem, and we've tried to. Let's deal with the other one, right? Some of these treatments of sublimation, because of the issues involved with social recognition, what gets completely left out is Freud's own insistence that the product of sublimation must also achieve social recognition, linked to the championship of a certain progress. This is what Freud paradoxically insisted on, to the surprise of many writers, probably to the surprise of many psychoanalysts, saying, Freud, do you really want to go there? Like, we're just doctors here. Can we really judge so well things outside the science? Freud insists, must achieve not just social recognition, but a championship of a certain progress in relation to them, right? And this is how Lacan bridges his aesthetics with his ethics. This is why aesthetics and sublimation comes up a lot in his ethics seminar. Why he's always talking about aesthetics, really. He loves examples from the arts, right? Sublimation creates a certain number of forms, among which art is not alone. It also creates socially recognized values, which, given Freud's insistence on a championed social progress, means it is as a function of the problem of ethics that we have to judge sublimation, including the sublimation of arts. Remember, not as a function of moralism, but as a function of ethics. And this idea that it creates socially recognized values, it could be read in a passive way, like create something that adheres to pre-existing socially recognized values. But I'm not sure that that's what they're saying. Those values are themselves what's created through the process of sublimation. Through a championship of progress, new values emerge, better values, through the process of sublimation, a more active version of that. We've got to be open to that as well. All right, let's look for some evidence. Let's have a look at what Nietzsche says, for example. Regarding all aesthetic values, I now avail myself of this main distinction. I ask in every instance, is it hunger, i.e. lack, or superabundance, nearness, that has here become creative? So he's talking about that distance towards the drive. Are we too far away, speaking from a position of lack? Are we too close, speaking of a position of perversion? Or we just have the right level of abundance, right? Let's have a look here on the right. That's how Nietzsche does this. Now, on the top line, he's actually finishing critiquing Schopenhauer's pessimism, saying Schopenhauer was such a sex-negative pessimist about sexuality. He really struggled with it himself. And he took revenge on all things by branding them with his image, the image of his torture. Because sexuality was such a torture for him, he said it's a torture for everyone. And he also sometimes took it out, as Nietzsche says, on the main object of his desire, women, right? And it's like, Schopenhauer, like, easy, mate, like, how are things at home? Getting on well with your mother? Actually, no. Like, we've got to not pretend, but we've got to be careful not of universalizing idiosyncrasy in this way. If we see someone doing it, it's like, I think you're speaking from lack. I don't think your sublimation is a very good one, very adequate one. I think you're too far from the thing. Bad experiences have led you to have that. And it's likewise for Nietzsche that beauty, right? Because Schopenhauer is rejecting sexual beauty in this way, but for Nietzsche, beauty is only of value also when it's not an escape, but the artist's expression of gratitude for happiness enjoyed. But the creativity is gratitude for their existence, not an escape from existence, but an affirmation of existence, right? This is what is bestowed in that making perfect. This is quoting Nietzsche, seeing as perfect, which characterizes the cerebral system bursting with sexual energy, which revives through contiguity is aphrodisiac bliss. We're here for Nietzsche, observed very, very, very proto-Freudianly, art and beauty is an indirect demand for ecstasies of sexuality communicated to the brain. As Freud puts it in Civilization as Discontents, aesthetic beauty is a derivation from the field of sexual feeling by an impulse inhibited in its aim, which is somehow we describe sublimation. But if inhibition sounds too negative, you say transformed, tweaked, altered, redirected, right? It definitely comes from sexual energy. The thing, right? Now let's have a look at what Sapankich says on this. She clarifies in her shortest shadow book, Lacan's ethics with reference to Nietzsche's here. She suggests that when Nietzsche defines nihilism, not as the absence of values, no one has values anymore, but as the absence of a power or mechanism for recreating values, this mechanism is what Lacan links to the notion of sublimation, to insist that the question of sublimation must be considered as a problem of ethics. Sublimation, to continue with Sapankich, at stake for Lacan in sublimation is the creation of values, not simply the act of adhering to already existing values. So she has a nice active version of sublimation there, right? It's not just about conforming to pre-existing values, assuming that they're already true and there's nothing more to say. It's about creating values, recreating values, tweaking, fine-tuning, improving. Sublimation enables us to create values like an artist in the field of ethics, and portraying new values in our works of art. We can infer the implications of any product of sublimation and make an ethical judgment. For although sublimation is a creative process that produces products in different fields, in none does it necessarily have to passively submit unthinkingly to pre-existing values. Sublimation can question, alter, improve, and seek progress, and doing so is felt by Lacan to be far from the gymnastic, dance, and other exercises that, for example, the acceptance of Kleinian categories can lead one to valorize in the name of sublimation, as if such exercises were wholly equivalent to what we find mounted and depicted in the Louvre. So Lacan thought that by Melanie Klein reducing the thing to the mother's body, she then ended up with a really puerile notion of sublimation, where sublimation is just about repairing the lesions you create to the mother's body when you're born, right? Which leaves out the paternal function, which leaves out the championship of social progress, and which leaves out massive differences in quality of art and ethical acts and social acts in general. Nothing against gymnastic, dance, and other exercises, but you know, it's hardly a revolution in the field of science or art or culture or politics when we engage in that. There are higher level sublimations, and Lacan wants to stress this, the championship of a certain social progress. Now, let's see if we can imbricate Lacan's treatment of sublimation with Nietzsche's aesthetic distinction between lack and abundance. Let's see how well this goes. What would creativity in Nietzsche's strong sense be? He talks about superabundance, right? It corresponds to the optimum relation we can have with a thing in sublimation, where the thing is at a serviceable distance. Nearness, distance and nearness for creativity. So we acceded to a non-neurotic attitude towards our drives, enabling us to use them to raise earthly entities into objects, aglow with dignity and affirmation, granting them the status sublime, according to what Nietzsche calls the bestowing virtue. If we're full with the passions of the thing in a nicely measured way, we can bestow on the things, the objects around us and on the drives within us in a certain way. Gratitude, energy, we don't have to deprive them, add to them. We bestow on them, we give the drive as a gift. What would creativity in the weak sense be? In Nietzsche's sense, based on lack, corresponds to a non-optimal relation we can have with the thing, sublimation, one more marred by repression, ignorance, hostility, and bad conscience. As the thing becomes denigrated, falsified, turned back violently against the self, and forced so far from conscious mind, the states of deprivation arise, leading us to similarly deprive earthly objects of the potential beauty, or see in them, as with Christian Platonism, something dangerous to negate, so as to reach a pretend real world imagined high beyond the stars. And we sort of discussed that in previous week, how the real world becomes a mythical world, and how historically we've tried to overcome that with varying degrees of success. Note the shared critique between Lacan and Nietzsche on Plato's aesthetics, on Plato's philosophy of art. What's Lacan saying in Seminar 7? We can only sense the great aberration that is articulated in the unyielding position of the philosopher. Plato places art at the lowest level of human works. How dare he, right? But that's what he does. Get these poets out of here. Stop performing these stupid tragedies. Now, Lacan is criticizing Plato for denying art's ability to reveal any hidden reality, especially that pertaining to the thing. And Lacan refers instead to the Cézanne who paints his apples to suggest he's also doing something very different from imitating apples, because Cézanne is establishing his apple object in a relationship with a thing that the work is intended to encircle and to render both present and absent. So I found a nice close shot of his still life here of the apples. And you can see, okay, they're apple objects, but it doesn't take too much to see the thing there too, right? Think of story of the eye. The eye is an egg. The eyes are nipples. Breast can be sucked like an eye. The eye can be sucked like a breast. The slang for buttocks, peaches. I know one Pilates instructor who, springtime, she says, "Come on, girls, work those peaches. Someone's coming up. You want to look good in your bathing suit, you know? Peaches, apples. How do you like them apples? Testicles, right?" You can see the thing there as well, and that's why, that maybe that's part of what moves him, what moves us when we see these wonderful objects. It's just a bit of fruit on the table, but still, there's something going on there, right? The thing is both present and absent. Right. So, art as the source of something real. Lacan contrasts this position with the Plato who held the artist was merely copying a sensory object that was an imperfect copy of its idea already, as if everything that exists only exists in relation to the idea, which is itself the real. Because for Plato, the idea is more real than the real itself. You've got the actual apple, then you've got the idea of the apple, which is more real because it's no longer sensory, it's purely ideational. So art, why would you want to replicate something sensory into a sensory medium? You're just a copy of a copy. You want to go to the pure abstract, forget anything sensory, forget anything material. And in fact, like Plato was so prejudiced over this that I think it was Plutarch who reported that even Plato's endorsement of geometry, he forbid his students or frown on them if they used like a standard geometrical instrument, like a ruler or a compass or a protractor. I don't know if they had protractor, whatever the instruments was. No, it has to be pure mind. That's what makes it better. So art for him was an abomination. Why would you take an empirical object and represent it in another empirical way or a sensory way, right? But for Lacan, this reduction of art to a shadow of a shadow or an imitation of imitation is a trap one must not enter. For not only can art indeed reveal the real, that is, the unconscious excluded reality of the thing, but this real has nothing at all ideal about it. Right? The Freudian thing might be a lot of things, but it's not ideal. It's not a Rousseauian nature that's there in the unconscious. It's neither good nor evil. It is what it is. What's Nietzsche say on this? For Plato to call the idea real and everything earthly, bodily, sensory a mere copy was the greatest of rebaptisms, and we fail to recognize how astonishing that is because it was adopted by Christianity. This also makes Plato the greatest enemy of art or sublimation, right? Europe has yet produced. Why? Because Plato claims to discover beyond the earth what he merely constructed or created in his own head. Follows that what he creates is hostile to the creative process just enacted, for he has just disavowed it, along with its all too human origins. Now, Nietzsche finds Plato's barring of the poets from the Republic significant to the structure of metaphysics to follow in the West, metaphysics of morality, invoking Plato versus Homer as the complete, genuine antagonism. Why? Because whereas Homer's poetry and the Olympian divinities before Plato in general gild golden and deify the forces of nature and embodied life here on the earth, you remember that even a founding king of Athens can be founded through a myth of a golden shower, Zeus, right? So we have this like reality and sort of beautification of all the like natural forces here going on in Homer and Olympian gods, right? Plato instead preaches a beyond of anything sensory to deify as good, which is what makes him for Nietzsche the great slanderer of life. Plato's world of the good amounts to believing in what one has created as if it were the truth in a way that erases all truth of its createdness, what Nietzsche now calls its last fumes of evaporating reality, as if the one final shred of truth about the sovereign good was that it was a construction, was that it was something imagined. But if you're now going to call not imagined but discovered as true and real itself, then there's no reality left with it. That was the last bit of like reality about that construct, that it was a construct. Now even that's gone. It's become a theology, onto-theology. Nietzsche also describes this as mistaking the last for the first, or mistaking the consequence for the cause, when ideas engendered by a certain condition are misunderstood as the cause of that condition, leading to the error of imaginary causes. Why is the world like this? Because the good causes it to do things. No. The earth like caused you to invent the good. Don't get it the wrong way around. That's what Nietzsche's saying here, right? The idea of the good is not cause but effect of a Platonist encounter with the earth, mistaken as cause of the earth itself. Now, Lacan's main example of a superlative form of creativity in his ethics is Sophocles' Antigone, a work of tragic art, the very form Nietzsche praised as highest in value and Plato debased as lowest. What's Stepankich say? For the Lacanian theory of sublimation does not suggest that sublimation turns away from the real in the name of some idea, does not work against the passions and the drives, but aims rather to create a stage in which it is possible to challenge the given criteria of morality and eventually formulate new, different ones. For example, the stage where we see Antigone come into conflict with Creon. Who's right, who's wrong, why? It enables us to create and question and reformulate the values. Plato, however, had already created his idea through neurotic substitution, because it's the opposite of the earth, a reaction against it, and thus wanted it universally installed, not challenged, which is why I wanted to burn Democritus's books, because Democritus was a materialist. While Lacan and Nietzsche see a danger in this, and so instead have found returning to the artist and sublimation to search for other creative possibilities and their source in the drive. But because of the lack of idealness inherent in the source, which is nothing other than the thing or real of an experience potentially tragic, it is tragic art that grants us fuller access to the real we have to work with. And for Nietzsche especially, it does so in a way that leaves us even more strongly equipped to handle the real in future. So there's something empowering about tragic art, despite the horror themes, because it's tragic what happens, but doesn't it give us some access to what the real is like in and of itself? We get some experience of it vicariously. On this basis, we might re-examine Lacan's ethics seminar reading of Sophocles' Antigone. Remember, he's putting them on the stage to see in what sense, as an example of a strongest type of sublimation, it has the ethical benefit of procuring more empowerment. It may be that Lacan's reading gets us closer to the real. So it's what he says about the beauty effect, right? Beauty gets us closer to the real than the good does. The good keeps us long, far away from the real, the jouissance in the real. So maybe tragedy and Antigone's beauty effect gets us closer to the real in a way that Nietzsche would take to be of much value to a strong ethical project based on strong sublimation, one of abundance. A value here that Plato's metaphysical term morality should be criticized for rendering increasingly lost. I finish here with a book that I found on Lacan and Nietzsche, which is dealing precisely with the notion of sublimation between the two, using Lacan's theory of the human drive, applying it to 3 works in Greek literature and philosophy, uses an analysis of Nietzsche's idea about the drives and sublimation, that the highest types are like the bow with the greatest tension. Maybe Lacan will be happy with how his work has been taken up. All right, leave it there. Now I have a request, Sandra, if you have a question, would it be possible to go first? If you got your arguments down already? Because
I have a question. What is the difference? Okay, I have just the difference between, I think I got the difference between drive and instinct. So drive is when there is, it goes through the symbolic, and but then where does desire fit into all of this? And where do we locate that concept into drive, instinct, or what all of this, what's going on? Because then it can fit, because desire for me is also, I don't know how to, but it also has to do with how we get it through the symbolic register. And sublimation, it also requires social recognition, and I'm sorry, this is a question that it's still, I still don't have it very clear. And this all relates to, yeah, so it is a question about giving a space, if I'm understanding correctly, and by reading what your investigation on all this has been, is to like go back to that to the animal, or to that real part of the instinct that is also in ancient literature, and that a notion of the good, as in Christianity, has tried to repress. So what we need is to, like, instead of like just negate it, is to like give it a chance to form a signifier. Is this correct? Am I understanding? And this is my questions. Thank you.
Very nicely put. I wanted you to go first because you're a good agenda setting questioner, and when you go at the end, it's like, then we can't keep going because we're already after time, because you've got good absorption and good engagement. So the question of desire is, that's the first thing you read, is at the level of the drives. So you've got instinct and thing, right, at the material level of the body and real, passes into consciousness over the frontier, becomes symbolized in image, that's the drive. And desire is a configuration of those drives, because the drives are connected to the partial objects and partial drives. Anal, oral, scopic, and invocatory. Scopic is what you see and what you show, invocatory, what you say and what you hear. And desire is generally a configuration of those four partial drives. Desire itself is Latin for libido. Libido is Latin for desire, as you would know better than me, right? Libido, yeah. But of course, it's also intertwined with aggressivity. So desire is there at the level of the drive as a configuration of them. But as we get from seminar 7, this is seminar 7 articulation, it's very close to Freud. As we get to seminar 11, the four concepts one, that's when he starts linking desire more with fantasy as a defense against enjoyment, as a defense against the drives. So so if you're reading, say, the Slovenian school literature, they go with the seminar 11 thing more so than I would with my more sort of Freudo-Nietzschean seminar 7 materialist kind of version. Yeah. Social recognition, the space, yeah, get that optimal space. Social recognition, not just passive submitting to value, but recreating them, and going back to the animality, to the primitivity, yeah, to recover what was lost and come back with a new articulation. So yeah, we do produce a signifier, a new signifier. Yeah, a new signifier, the main tail, new values, new articulations, new images. Yeah, instead of repression and return of the oppressed symptom. So yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
No worries. William.
Thanks so much, Tim. And just a comment before my questions, which are related to Sandra's as well. And it goes to Plato and his relationship with artists and the arts. And I know he banishes the poets, as you say, in the Republic, scandalously, so that's at least what's being said, but also how he's saying it is through one of the great works of art, one of the great literary texts of the Western tradition. So there's this tremendous irony here, and maybe that's Platonic irony of the artist who banishes artists, you know. So I think this might be a little bit explain why Lacan's attitude towards Plato may be a bit more complicated than Nietzsche's, for example. You know, so he's always urging us to read Plato, and it might be because of that, precisely that paradox. But my question was more specific and really goes to jouissance. So Sandra was asking about desire. I'm just wondering, where's jouissance here? And is it on the side of the drive, or is it on the side of the thing? And if it's on the side of the thing, is elevating the object to the status of the thing and its sublimity, is that a new form of mysticism?
Okay. Is there a third question?
No.
No? All right,
Sorry, those are the two.
Those are the two-parter. Okay, so Plato, the arts, his banishing of the poets, and also his dismissing of tragedy in I think it was the Georges, which Carl mentions in 7 or 8, calling tragedy just one of the arts among the rhetoric of flattery, right? Really disparaging. And yet, is he a great artist himself? Well, there is an artisticness to him, no doubt, right? But there's also a sense where he disavows what he creates. I didn't create this, I discovered it. So there's also something disingenuous about what he's doing, which is why art is like his own shadow. I didn't create the good, I discovered it. So there's that issue there.
I guess what I'm just saying is that there's an enunciation, and then there's a position from which someone is enunciating, and there's this difference between content and form, you know, and you know, the form is artistic, is aesthetic, you know, the content may be, you know, strange and hostile.
Yeah, he's not giving all his arguments in standard form. They're dialogues, and they can be fun to read. But I think Nietzsche's right. Like, I think they can also be incredibly tedious. And like Nietzsche was like, don't get me started on the like great literary quality of Plato's dialogue.
Oh, Nietzsche's
Plato is. Hang on a second.
Nietzsche's clear.
Let me get to the end. You can come back afterwards. Plato is a bore, you know, don't get me started. So, and some of them, like there was one I discovered recently because Lacan mentioned it, or a scholar mentioned it. Was it the Theaetetus, or one of them is supposed to be the founding like dialogue on linguistics. What's the relation of words and things, and the dialogue between, you know, someone from the Heraclitean tradition in Parmenides. I'll read this, got the lerp thing out. Oh, how long-winded. Like, you know, it's like I could see what Nietzsche's saying too, even though I wanted to read it as a historical treasure, right? But it can get long-winded too. And when you know that he's kind of like fudging the facts a little bit in his intent, pretending to discover what he creates, distorting certain truths that we are best to acknowledge. So yeah, look, Lacan says read him, but like Lacan also says read Luther. Like he quotes Luther in the Seminar 7 saying humanity is excrement from the devil's anus. And he's like, so that's why you should read this stuff. Yeah, so read it as evidence. Yeah, if you enjoy it, like, man, it's amazing historical moment, and it's a very important one. So it's good to read as an analyst, whether one enjoys the aesthetic form or not. Now, can I move to jouissance? Second part?
Of course.
Okay. Okay, that was a good question. Is jouissance located closer to the drive or closer to the thing? It's closer to the drive than desire and fantasy, especially in the Seminar 11 kind of schematization. Now, the drive is already kind of close to the thing, I guess, insofar as we start signifying and imaging the drive and its object in a defensive way, then we get further away again into some kind of a Puritan or denaturalizing, inflated sort of fantasy. And that would create the kind of Christian Platonic mysticism that's a problem, that leads to loss of knowledge of the real, of the thing, and loss of satisfaction. So it's not really a sublimation anymore. When you compare that with Homer, okay, like I'm not at all advocating that we believe Homeric myths literally, but as metaphors, they give us a much closer affirmation of the drives in these myths and images. The stories of Persephone and Hades, the stories of Perseus and Zeus's golden shower, and the list can just go on with all the gods and goddesses. So it doesn't need to lead to a mysticism. Just like when we look at a work of art, we don't have to believe that this film actually happened. It's a work of fiction, right? It leads us to affirm the drives to this fictional structure. The truth can be established there, but we don't have to believe in it literally. And that's, the Homeric tradition had an excuse. They were before the founding of Western science and philosophy. Plato, Paul, Christians, yeah, there's no excuse. They fudged findings of science and philosophy in order to get us to believe a new version of myths, because they thought it was going to be good for us. Plato anyway, right? Plato wanted us to believe in the immortality of the soul, even though he allegedly did not believe it himself. He was found on his deathbed with a copy of Aristophanes under his pillow. Right. I'll leave that one there.
Thank you.
No worries. Roscoe.
Roscoe, I haven't been called that for a long time.
You're so familiar to me now. I saw you Saturday night. Here we are, Tuesday night.
Well, you're right, though. Friends from way back called me Roscoe. That was my nickname. You might have known, you might have met up with one of them. No, I mean, I'm going way back. Look, about the sublimation and strong values, is that what Nietzsche it sort of promotes, isn't it, as something of the good when you're in art and culture? Is that what you're saying? And that weak sublimation, which is more or less referring to that of Platonism and his idealism. I mean, the problem I got here, if I got this all right, is that that when it comes to sublimation and creativity and art and so forth, performance art and so forth, especially, look, I'm focusing on the trans issue here because I was quite shocked only a couple of days ago when they set up a petition. There was over 100,000 people who signed a petition that with Medicare that it should be for free, which I think is a very dangerous proposition, considering. And the reason why I say it's a dangerous proposition if the politicians take it seriously, of course, there'd be parents with their young children and so forth that get caught up in this ideology. But what I think is dangerous about it is that the petition itself, with those who are motivated to sign it, are caught up in some kind of fantasy, in the imaginary and so forth, and into that ideal, which is, I would say, comes under the category of weak sublimation. It's very dangerous in that context because it's now being incorporated within our values of today that, LGBTI people must be accepted and so forth. I'm just very concerned about that. Am I on the right track here in what you've been saying about strong and weak sublimations?
I suspect so. I'm not across that Medicare issue. So was the petition to make Medicare incur
when it comes to surgery, where there is no return, it will be all covered. Yeah. Whereas there's no sense of gender
reassignment surgery in particular.
Yeah, that one. Yeah. Okay. And there's no return, and it's surely it's not that much, mate. I mean, it's probably $18,000 or something like that, but thing is that they can actually save up and whatever, and of course hormone treatment would actually be enough to satisfy their own, you see what I'm getting at.
Okay, so it's not that so there's cases where gender reassignment surgery would be valid, and in those cases it should be available free, but it shouldn't be pushed ideologically so that people are getting that change when other procedures may be just as helpful.
But just as helpful, but sort of that as well. But it's just that what I'm trying to say is that there, because it is an idealism, right? I do see that as such, right? It's an ideology, okay? I do see that, and the thing is that people do get caught up in it, and they think that truly to be accepted and is to have surgery and then opening the doors like that, because for many years it wasn't like that. They're trying to open up the doors and make it a far more easier access to it and so forth. And I think there should be, I'm just concerned And of course, most of these people who sign those petitions probably won't even have surgery in the end anyway, because it's just the fantasy, the sublimation in that context. I suppose that's what I was getting at. And so there's a kind of like a falsehood with that fantasy, with the signatory of 100,000 people, you know, that goes to the politicians, that they're not really getting the real picture here. Do you kind of understand what I'm getting at?
I think so, yeah. So while this seems to be a progressive version of the good, countering a conservative version of the good, it's actually caught up in fantasy in itself for denying the real and the unconscious nature of the drives. So, for example, if you and I were going to legislate what should be covered under Medicare, it might be take someone like Patricia Geravici as your analyst. And if at the end of that you want whatever surgery you want, you got it. Right. Sessions covered, surgery covered, yeah. But for people who don't have the transsexual experience themselves, signing on behalf of others, and those others too, you might not know that psychoanalysis could be helpful on this. Yeah, there's a sense where the good that they're enacting can be a kind of defense. So it's not really strong values. It attempts to be, but it's a little bit blinded as part of the foreclosure of psychoanalysis from general socially recognized values and the neoliberal distortion as well of the medico industrial industry. Okay, we should not have user pays dominating everything for marginalized groups, but don't use that good as an excuse to distort it by pushing surgeries and procedures on people kind of ideologically without taking into account the real. So yeah,
I think you answered my question, but I also want to make it perfectly clear. I have no objections when some people do, want that surgery because they're very suicidal and so forth like that. I want to make that clear. But yeah, I just want an opinion on that actually, since you're an expert in this field. I mean, not in LGBTI, but an expert generally. Yeah.
When it comes to LGBT, I defer to Patricia Geravici and Sheila Kavanagh. I think has done some good stuff on that too. Like I've listened to some of their podcasts, read some of their books, and it's great. Yeah, and I would make that available free on Medicare. I would make Lacanian psychoanalysis available free on Medicare for everyone instead of like CBT. Yeah, exactly. So even when we think we're being progressive against the conservatives, if we ignore psychoanalysis and good cultural traditions of knowledge, we can be blinded just as much as the conservatives on the left. And it can be used cynically, like there's the notion of femwash and pinkwash. It's like, for example, we're going to impose apartheid on Palestinians, but look how good we're doing on LGBT issues, like don't look at that, just focus on that. And that's really cynical as well. If we're aiming to stop marginalization, it should be across the board, not amplify one issue in order to hide from another issue, which is actually really egregious right now. So yeah, that's how the good can act as something to be aware of. Now, some of politics are good, whose interest does it serve? It's good to ask questions like that. And how do we know? Yeah, how sure are we? Yeah. All right. Should I cross to Jaya? It's after 9 o'clock. Jaya? Yes. Hi.
Yeah. Hi. So I wanted to ask, in terms of sublimation, in the realm of the sexual and the erotic, that would playing in the BDSM community, could that possibly qualify as sublimation, or is it only the esoteric stuff like art, good art? Because some words that you said resonated, mysticism, free association, different sort of ethics within the community, around consent or being non-judgmental. So I don't know, is there any, or does sublimation have to be something in particular to qualify? And I also wanted to ask about jouissance, that I mean, I'm still struggling to understand, because, and especially when you say jouissance of transgression, that in terms of desire, isn't all, like Bruce Fink says, prohibition eroticizes. So isn't all a desire, like in the realm of neurosis, isn't there transgression happening necessarily? So is it always jouissance that is experienced when transgression happens, or is jouissance referring to something in particular? And just does jouissance look different if we think of neurosis and if we think of perversion? I'm completely confused about jouissance. I don't know if this is the right place to ask, but I thought I would.
Yeah, okay. I might start from the end on this one. Actually, no, I won't, because then I'll forget what we said at the start by the time I get to the end. All right, so the start was, okay, is sublimation just great works of art, like the Louvre or something like that, right? Or can it be sexual practice? Yes, it can totally be sexual practice. Absolutely. And he even uses the example of courtly love was about writing poems about the lady, but it was also about a practice of relation, of service. Yes, my lady, my dear lady. And there's that example of the poem where, you know, the knight is asked to give cunnilingus to the lady, and he gets, you know, hysterical about it. Oh, what am I going to do with that? You know, she could piss on my snout. It could be hairy. It could be wet. Like it's all hysterical symbol of negation. But take that out, and it's pretty pornographic, right? And Lacan saying, you know, it doesn't have to be completely desexualized for it to be a sublimation. Yeah, it's still like an aestheticized process. And that would be, I would say, the same as in BDSM communities. There's an incredible amount of aestheticization that goes on in them sometimes. Like I think of a few porn production companies that do it. Harmony, I think one's called. There was Tanya Hyde, I think, a female bodybuilder and model who started directing them. It's like the amount of aestheticization is fantastic. And some of this stuff you see at actual clubs, people dress like that, people act like that. So it's definitely a sublimation. There's a sense where as soon as you deviate from a thing in any way, it's sublimation. If you're like fucking someone who's not your parents, it's already a sublimation in a way, because the object is already not the thing. It's already separated from the thing. The thing is the early experience. The object in some ways replaces it. If it's not a substitution, but it somehow invokes it, you know, some of the BDSM people have had violence in their background or have resentment they want to act out, but in a play way, like in some of the documentaries we showed it. And that's a sublimation, especially if they're aware of the source of it, which some of the practitioners were in that kink documentary. Not all were. Maybe they just didn't want to say on a public video. I know I probably wouldn't, but some were quite open about it too, which shows there is no inconduit between the initial experiences of the thing and the current aesthetic erotic process with the erotic object. Now, the issue of consent and non-judgmentalism in the BDSM community, yeah, well, I guess it can be invested neurotically and perversely as well. And no judgmentalism means no analysis. I don't want to know about my thing. I just want to see this as like rights and representation, each to their own. And so it could be a neurotic substitution or a perverse disavowal. So that could definitely be going on there too. We have to look at the specificity of every individual involved. It's going to be different, right? And an analyst who's working with somebody from that community has to look at that too. Not come in with pre-judgmental categories, but also not abandon the role of analysis. Look at the specificity in play, the case history, and see what the subject themselves presents. And the final point was about jouissance of transgression, neurosis, does the neurotic experience jouissance of transgression? I think the clue to this is when Lacan says, unlike Sartre's catalogue of horrors, all the violent acts in his fictions, what you're going to see if this bomb goes off, right, is going to pale anything Sartre would think of into comparison. But unlike Sartre and his fictional characters, the ones who set this bomb off aren't going to get any pleasure from it. Bureaucrats, not perverts, will set this thing off, right? And there's chain of command. Yes, sir. Like Eichmann. Yes, sir. Melody of evil. So there's a sense where no pleasure in it is also no jouissance. There's no enjoyment at all, to use pleasure loosely there. The neurotic tends to like caught up in the good. I'm just doing what I'm told for the good of the fatherland, for the good of the empire. Yes, nuke Japan after firebombing in cities. Yep, for the good of the allies. We're the good. We're not capitalist. Yeah. There's a sense where the jouissance involved in that is pretty veiled. There is transgression involved, but they might not really be aware of the jouissance. Maybe at some level, but they probably just rationalize it. Oh, this is all part of a logic, you know. So it's like Lacan says, according to Freud, the good keeps us a long way from our jouissance. So they commit these transgressive acts, but don't really know anything about the jouissance of transgression involved. It can be veiled, but it can be operating unconsciously. Who knows what they're thinking unconsciously? That's what I would say to that. Okay, 9:12. Would anyone else like to say a quick one-liner, or should we leave it there?
I don't have a one-liner, but I just want to say thank you, Tim. I mean, I found that harrowing, especially at the beginning. It's really hellish to sort of have our situation laid out on that scale and with that finesse to really encounter it. So thank you for my harrowing experience. But in the context of the whole thing, the context stays with me. That's what I got out of it. I'm just saying thank you.
Thank you. That's the kind of feedback that one desires to bear the, you know, we're the bearer of bad tidings, but it's not to crush people. It's to eventually help us solve these problems like an engineer. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. We'll leave it there and come back next week.